Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The information presented in this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or professional matrimonial advice. Divorce laws, property division statutes, and custody guidelines vary significantly by state and jurisdiction. The historical data and demographic trends discussed here reflect broad societal patterns and potential outcomes based on historical trends and case studies, rather than individual guarantees. You should consult with a qualified legal professional or a licensed financial advisor regarding your specific circumstances and conduct your own due diligence before making any significant life decisions. In 1969, a single signature on a legislative document in California triggered a tectonic shift in the American family structure that almost no one saw coming. Before that moment, if you wanted to end a marriage in the United States, you effectively had to put your spouse on trial. You had to prove fault, adultery, abandonment, or extreme physical cruelty. But when then-Governor Ronald Reagan signed the Family Law Act, introducing the first no-fault divorce law in the country, the floodgates did not just open, they burst. Within a single decade, the national divorce rate nearly doubled, and a statistic was born that has haunted the American psyche for half a century. 50% of all marriages end in divorce. But what if I told you that this iconic number is not only outdated but, for the majority of the people watching this video, it is mathematically misleading? What if the reality of who gets divorced when they do it, and why they do it has shifted so radically in the last 20 years that the old playbook is completely obsolete? We are currently living through a period of the Great Divorce Divide, where your zip code, your college degree, and even the year you were born are more predictive of your marital success than the concept of love itself. Today, we are embarking on a deep dive masterclass into the demographics of divorce. This is not a surface-level look at celebrity breakups. This is a data-driven investigation into the historical trends that have shaped the American home. By the end of this series, you will understand the hidden economic engines behind marital stability, the surprising truth about the gray divorce explosion among baby boomers, and why the younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, might actually be the most pro-marriage cohorts we have seen in a century. We are going to solve the mystery of why divorce rates are plummeting for some while skyrocketing for others, providing you with a roadmap of the historical trends that define the modern American landscape. To understand where we are, we have to look at the mathematical framework of how we measure divorce. Most people cite the crude divorce rate, which is a simple calculation: the number of divorces per 1,000 people in the total population. The formula looks like this: CDR equals total population, number of divorces, times 1,000. However, this number is deeply flawed because it includes children, single people, and the elderly who aren't even eligible for divorce. To get the real story, sociologists use the refined divorce rate, which measures divorces per 1,000 married women. When you look at the historical trends through this lens, you see a massive spike beginning in the mid-1960s, peaking in 1981, and then beginning a slow, steady decline that continues to this day. Why did 1981 mark the high water mark? To answer that, we have to look at the intersection of law and culture. The transition to no-fault divorce was a legal revolution. Before this, fault-based divorce created a divorce mill industry where couples would actually stage photos of infidelity, just to satisfy the court's requirement for a legal split. When the law caught up to social reality, a massive backlog of dead-end marriages was cleared out. This created an artificial bulge in the data. Think of it as a pressure cooker that had been simmering for decades. Once the valve was released, the steam came out all at once. But the 1970s and 80s spike was not just about the law. It was about the marriage squeeze. This is a demographic phenomenon that occurs when there is an imbalance between the number of marriageable men and women in a specific cohort. For the baby boomers, who were hitting marriage age in the late 60s, there were suddenly millions more women than men due to the rapid population growth of the post-war era. This shifted the bargaining power within relationships and contributed to a period of high marital instability. We also have to address the educational gap, which is perhaps the most significant demographic predictor in modern history. In the 1970s, divorce was relatively egalitarian. It happened at similar rates across all social classes. Today, we see a massive divorce divide. For couples where both partners have a 4-year college degree, the divorce rate has plummeted to levels not seen since the 1960s. Conversely, for those with a high school diploma or less, the rates remain stubbornly high. This isn't just about money, it's about assortative mating. People are increasingly marrying others with similar educational and economic backgrounds, creating power couples that are statistically more resilient to the external shocks, like job loss or health crises, that often trigger a domestic breakdown. Case studies from the U.S. Census Bureau and the American Community Survey show that the age of first marriage is the second most powerful lever in these historical trends. In 1960, the median age for a first marriage was 20 for women and 23 for men. Today, those numbers have jumped to 28 and 30. Mathematically, every year you wait to get married after the age of 22 reduces your statistical likelihood of divorce by approximately 11%, up until your early 30s. This is the maturity effect. Younger couples often lack the interpersonal capital, the communication skills and emotional regulation necessary to navigate the friction of long-term cohabitation. However, as we look at the historical trends, a new and contradictory pattern emerges: gray divorce. While the overall divorce rate in the U.S. is technically falling, the rate for adults over the age of 50 has doubled since the 1990s. For those over 65, it has tripled. This is a demographic anomaly that defies the general downward trend. We have to ask, why are couples who have been together for 30 or 40 years suddenly calling it quits? The data suggests a combination of increased life expectancy, people realizing they might have 30 active years left and don't want to spend them in an unhappy union, and the empty nest syndrome, where the primary glue of the marriage, the children, has left the home, revealing a structural void in the relationship. Throughout this deep dive, we are going to look at geographic variations as well. It is a common misconception that liberal states have higher divorce rates. In reality, the Bible Belt often sees higher rates of divorce than the Northeast. This paradox is explained by the early marriage culture prevalent in those regions. By marrying younger, these cohorts are exposed to higher statistical risk, proving that cultural values often run headfirst into demographic realities. We are setting the stage to move beyond the headlines. We are going to look at the 7-year itch, and whether it actually exists in the data. Spoiler: the median duration of a marriage that ends in divorce is actually closer to 8 years. We will examine the economic fallout, specifically why women's household income tends to drop by 41% post-divorce, while men's income drops by only 20%. Understanding these historical trends is not just about looking backward. It is about providing the U.S. audience with the clarity needed to understand the social structures of today. We aren't just talking about the end of marriages, we are talking about the evolution of the American identity. To understand the modern landscape of American divorce in 2026, we have to look at the invisible architecture of the home. Imagine if we could go back to 1955 and meet a couple like James and Betty in a suburb of Ohio. In their era, the economic and social costs of leaving a marriage were so high that they effectively functioned as a form of social gravity, holding the family unit together regardless of internal satisfaction. James was the sole breadwinner, and Betty had no independent access to credit or significant career prospects. Their marriage was a survival pact. Contrast that with James and Olivia in 2026. They live in a high-rise in Charlotte, North Carolina. Both are remote tech workers with independent retirement accounts and professional networks. For James and Olivia, marriage is no longer a survival necessity. It is a choice. This shift from marriage as a foundation to marriage as a capstone is the primary driver of the demographics we see today. When we talk about the capstone marriage, we are looking at a historical trend where individuals now wait until they have completed their education, established their careers, and reached a level of financial stability before saying I do. This has created a massive socioeconomic divide. In 2026, the data shows that a college degree acts as a shield against marital instability. Case studies from the U.S. Census Bureau indicate that women with a bachelor's degree have a nearly 78% probability that their marriage will last at least 20 years. For women with a high school diploma or less, that probability drops to about 40%. This is not just a coincidence. It is the result of what sociologists call assortative mating. In 2026, people are more likely to marry within their own educational and income bracket than ever before. This creates a compounding effect where high-income, highly educated couples pool their resources, creating a financial safety net that buffers them against the stressors that typically lead to divorce. Imagine a scenario where a sudden medical emergency or a job loss hits a household. For a couple with multiple degrees and significant savings, this is a crisis to be managed. For a couple living paycheck to paycheck, this is a catastrophic event that often leads to increased domestic friction, resentment, and eventually, a filing for dissolution. In 2026, we are seeing the emergence of a two-tier matrimonial system in the United States. On one tier, you have the stable, well-resourced marriages of the professional class. On the other, you have a more volatile environment for the working class, where the lack of economic security makes long-term commitment harder to sustain. This is the reality of the divorce divide. But the data takes an even more interesting turn when we look at the specific professions that correlate with high divorce rates. Historical trends from the Bureau of Labor Statistics show a fascinating correlation between your daily work environment and your marital outcome. In 2026, occupations that involve high levels of social interaction or irregular hours, such as bartenders, flight attendants, and hospitality workers, consistently show higher rates of divorce. Why? It isn't just about the hours, it is about the opportunity. When your job puts you in a position where you are constantly meeting new people and operating outside of the traditional 9-to-5 family structure, the social barriers to exiting a marriage are lower. Conversely, professions like actuaries, clergy, and engineers consistently show the lowest rates of divorce. These roles often attract individuals with a high degree of risk aversion and a focus on long-term planning, traits that translate directly into marital stability. Now, let's look at the phenomenon of the 661 demographic shift, the specific age-related spikes we are seeing in 2026. While the general divorce rate has been trending downward, the over 50 demographic is bucking the trend completely. This is the era of the gray divorce. Take the case of David and Jennifer, a couple in their late 50s living in Scottsdale, Arizona. They have been married for 30 years. Their children have moved out, and they find themselves looking at each other across a dinner table with nothing to say. In 1980, a couple like David and Jennifer would likely have stayed together due to social stigma or financial dependency. But in 2026, Jennifer has her own career and a social circle that supports her independence. She realizes she could live another 30 years and chooses to spend them differently. The historical trend shows that for this age group, the stigma of divorce has almost entirely vanished. It is no longer seen as a failure of character, but as a lifestyle transition. The statistics for gray divorce are staggering. Since 1990, the divorce rate for those aged 50 and older has doubled, and for those over 65 it has tripled. This has profound implications for the American economy. In 2026, we are seeing a massive redistribution of wealth as these long-term marriages are dissolved. Retirement accounts are split, homes are sold, and the cost of living doubles as one household becomes two. This demographic shift is creating a new class of aging singles who are navigating the dating market for the first time in decades, often using technology and apps that didn't exist when they first got married. Consider the role of technology in 2026. It has fundamentally changed the replacement market. In the past, if you were unhappy in a marriage, your options for finding a new partner were limited to your immediate social circle or workplace. Today, the digital landscape provides an infinite shelf of potential alternatives. This creates a psychological phenomenon known as the paradox of choice. When individuals feel that there is always a better option just one swipe away, their commitment to working through the inevitable friction of a long-term marriage can diminish. Historical trends indicate that technology hasn't just made it easier to get a divorce, it has changed the way we value our current partners. But there is a counter-trend happening with Gen Z and younger millennials in 2026. These cohorts are witnessing the volatility of their parents' and grandparents' generations and are reacting by being hyper-selective. They are engaging in what experts call the slow love movement. They are dating longer, cohabitating for years before marriage, and ensuring their financial houses are in order before signing a legal contract. This cautiousness is actually leading to a stabilization of the divorce rate among younger Americans. They aren't avoiding marriage because they don't believe in it. They are delaying it because they want to ensure it lasts. As we look deeper into the demographics, we have to address the geography of divorce. Why is it that in 2026, states like Nevada, Oklahoma, and Arkansas consistently have higher divorce rates than Massachusetts or New York? It comes down to the age of first marriage. In the Northeast, the cultural and economic norm is to delay marriage until the late 20s or early 30s. In the South and Midwest, it is more common to marry in the early 20s. This 10-year gap is a massive predictor of marital success. When you marry at 21, you are still a work in progress. Your brain isn't even fully developed until 25. By the time you reach 30, you may be a completely different person than the one who walked down the aisle. This brings us to a critical realization about the American identity in 2026. We are a nation that values individual happiness and personal fulfillment above almost all else. This cultural shift from a collective, family-oriented society to an individualistic one has redefined the marital contract. It is no longer about fulfilling a role. It is about finding a soulmate. But soulmates are statistically harder to maintain than partners. What happens when the soulmate ideal meets the reality of the 7-year itch? Is there a specific year in a marriage that acts as a mathematical tipping point? And what is the shocking truth about who actually initiates divorce in the United States in 2026? The data on gender and initiation is one of the most controversial and revealing aspects of this entire study, and it challenges everything we think we know about domestic satisfaction. In the next part, we are going to look at the explosive data behind why women are initiating 70% of all divorces in the US, and we will dive into the specific psychological triggers that occur in the 3rd year of marriage that can predict a split 4 years before it happens. Stay tuned as we uncover the secret math of the marital breakdown. The 70% statistic is perhaps the most disruptive piece of data in the entire study of American matrimonial history. In 2026, if you look at a room of 100 divorced couples, in 70 of those cases, the woman was the one who physically walked into a clerk's office or logged onto a legal portal to file the initial petition. When you narrow that demographic down to college-educated women, the number surges toward 90%. To understand why this happens, we have to look at a phenomenon known as the walkaway wife syndrome, a term that describes a years-long process of emotional erosion that finally culminates in a legal exit. This isn't a snap decision. It is the final step in a decade-long historical trend of shifting domestic expectations. Imagine a couple in 2026 named Michael and Sarah. They married in their late 20s, both have successful careers in the burgeoning tech healthcare sector in Austin, Texas, and they have one child. From the outside, their marriage looks like the gold standard of the capstone model we discussed earlier. But underneath the surface, a demographic timer is ticking. Research into marital satisfaction indicates that the 3rd year of marriage is often the psychological pivot point. This is the period when the neurochemical high of the early relationship, the literal flood of dopamine and oxytocin, begins to normalize. In this 3rd year, the couple enters the reality phase. For Sarah, this is when the unequal distribution of cognitive labor starts to manifest. Even in 2026, with all our advancements in workplace equity, the historical trend of the second shift persists. This is the concept where women, even those working full-time high-status jobs, perform a disproportionate amount of the household management and emotional upkeep. Data from the American Time Use Survey suggests that even when both partners work equal hours, women still perform roughly 40% more childcare and 30% more housework. Over time, this creates a state of chronic resentment. For Michael, the marriage feels stable because his needs are being met and the domestic gears are turning. For Sarah, the marriage feels like an additional management project. By year 4 or 5, she begins to voice these concerns. In the data, this is often recorded as high-conflict communication, but sociologists see it as a bid for connection and structural change. When those bids are ignored over a period of years, the wife often goes silent. This silence is frequently mistaken by the husband as the relationship getting better or the conflict resolving. In reality, it is the moment the wife has emotionally checked out and begun the logistical planning for an exit. By the time the papers are served in year 7 or 8, the husband is often blindsided, while the wife has been grieving the marriage for 3 years already. This discrepancy in initiation rates also tells us something profound about the economic liberation of women in U.S. history. In the 1950s, a woman might have been just as unhappy, but the demographic data showed she wouldn't leave because she literally couldn't afford to. In 2026, the historical trend has shifted toward female economic autonomy. A woman with a college degree and a career has the financial agency to choose a higher quality of life over a low-satisfaction marriage. This is why we see the highest initiation rates among the most educated demographics. Education provides the exit ramp, but we must also look at the role of the first child in these demographic shifts. Historically, the transition to parenthood is one of the most dangerous times for a marriage. Data shows a significant drop in marital satisfaction following the birth of the first child, and it doesn't typically recover until that child leaves the home. This is the U-shaped curve of marital happiness. In 2026, the pressure of intensive parenting has only intensified. Couples are spending more time and money on their children than any generation in U.S. history, often at the expense of the marital bond. When the focus shifts entirely to the child, the husband and wife become mere co-administrators of a small non-profit organization called the family. When that organization's primary project, the child, reaches school age around year 6 or 7, the couple is forced to look at each other again. only to realize they have become strangers. There is also a fascinating biological component to this 661 demographic study. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that the 7-year itch might actually be a 4-year cycle rooted in our ancestral history. Historically, the time it took to wean a child and ensure its survival to a semi-independent state was roughly 4 years. Once that period ended, the biological imperative to stay in a pair bond weakened. While we are no longer living in the Pleistocene, these deep-seated psychological drivers still influence our behavior. When combined with the modern stresses of 2026, this 4-year biological itch often manifests as a 7-year legal split. We also have to consider the role of the legal system itself. In 2026, the rise of collaborative divorce and no-court mediation has lowered the barrier to entry for ending a marriage. When divorce was an adversarial, high-cost battle, people stayed in bad situations longer. Today, the process is being streamlined by technology. Case studies show that many couples are now using AI-driven mediation platforms to divide assets and calculate support payments, bypassing the $300 an hour attorney fees that once acted as a financial deterrent. This ease of process doesn't necessarily cause divorce, but it certainly accelerates the timeline for those who have already decided to leave. But what about the 30% of men who do initiate? The data here is equally revealing. When men initiate divorce, it is statistically more likely to be triggered by an external factor, such as a new partner or a major midlife transition, whereas women's initiation is more likely to be triggered by internal relationship dissatisfaction. This suggests a fundamental difference in how genders view the marital contract in the 21st century. For many men in the demographic data, the marriage is a background state that provides stability while they pursue external goals. For many women, the marriage is an active, evolving project that requires constant maintenance and emotional equity. Now let's look at the hidden impact of the housing market in 2026. One of the most significant historical trends we are currently observing is the divorce mortgage lockout. With interest rates and home prices remaining high, many couples who want to divorce find themselves trapped in the same house. They are mathematically divorced but physically cohabitating because they cannot afford to split their 3% mortgage into two 7% mortgages. This is creating a new demographic of the married single, where couples live separate lives under one roof. This stagnant data doesn't show up in the filing rates immediately, but it is creating a pressure cooker of domestic tension that experts believe will lead to a massive spike in filings the moment the housing market shifts. We are seeing a landscape where the demographics of divorce are no longer just about who is unhappy. They are about who has the resources to leave, who has the emotional threshold for loneliness, and who is willing to trade financial security for personal peace. But as we peel back these layers, a new question emerges. If women are initiating at such high rates, and if the educational divide is growing, what does this mean for the future of the American family? Are we moving toward a society where marriage is a luxury good available only to the elite? In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the devastating data behind the divorce cascade. This is the phenomenon where one divorce in a social circle increases the likelihood of your own divorce by 75%. We will explore the contagion effect of marital dissolution and how your friends' choices might be the single biggest threat to your own domestic stability. We will also dive into the specific financial metrics of the 2026 asset split and why the middle class is being hit the hardest. The social contagion of divorce is not a metaphor. It is a statistically verifiable phenomenon known as the divorce cascade. In 2026, researchers have solidified the data showing that divorce moves through social networks much like a virus. If you have a close friend who gets divorced, your own statistical likelihood of experiencing a marital dissolution increases by a staggering 75%. This isn't because you are copycatting their behavior, but because their exit changes the social ecosystem of your entire circle. Imagine a social group in a suburb of Chicago in 2026. Let's look at a character named Robert. Robert and his wife have been married for 12 years. They have the standard stressors, career plateaus, teenage children, and a mortgage that feels slightly too heavy. 4 years they have socialized with 3 other couples. These couples form a protective buffer. As long as everyone stays married, the collective social norm is stability. But then one couple in the group, let's call them the Millers, decides to exit. Suddenly, the invisible barrier is broken. Robert sees his friend Mark Miller moving into a sleek new apartment downtown, re-entering the dating world, and seemingly shedding the weight of domestic conflict. Simultaneously, Robert's wife sees Mrs. Miller gaining a new sense of autonomy and individual identity. The The divorce cascade operates on the principle of social comparison. When a peer divorces, it provides a vivid case study of an alternative life. It lowers the perceived social cost of leaving and provides a roadmap for the logistics of a split. The data suggests that this effect even extends to 2 degrees of separation. If a friend of a friend gets divorced, your risk still sits at a 33% increase. This is the ripple effect of the 661 demographic, a historical trend where the individual's choice is heavily influenced by the collective stability. Now let's pivot to the cold, hard mathematics of the 2026 asset split, which is currently dismantling the American middle class at an unprecedented rate. In previous decades, the primary hurdle in a divorce was the emotional toll. Today, it is the structural impossibility of maintaining 2 households on the same income stream that once supported one. In 2026, we are seeing the emergence of the divorce trap. Consider the housing market. Many couples married between 2015 and 2021 are sitting on mortgage rates of 3% or lower. In the current 2026 economy, where prevailing interest rates for a new mortgage hover significantly higher, the math of a house buyout is catastrophic. Imagine Robert and his wife want to divorce. Their home in Chicago is valued at $600,000. They owe $300,000 on a 2.8% mortgage. In a standard 50-50 split, one spouse would need to buy out the other's $150,000 in equity. However, to do this, the staying spouse must refinance the entire $450,000 debt at the 2026 rate of 7 or 8%. Their monthly mortgage payment would effectively triple. For the middle class, this is the golden handcuff scenario. Historical trends show that more couples are opting for bird nesting, where the children stay in the family home and the parents rotate in and out, not because it is psychologically ideal, but because it is the only way to avoid a total financial collapse. Beyond the real estate, we have to look at the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO. This is the legal instrument used to split retirement accounts like 401ks and IRAs. In 2026, with the volatility of the markets, the timing of a QDRO can result in a massive loss of future wealth. Case studies show that a middle-class couple divorcing at age 45 will see their projected retirement age pushed back by an average of 8 to 10 years. This is because they lose the power of compound interest on a larger principal sum. When you split a $500,000 account into 2 $250,000 accounts, you aren't just having the money, you are fracturing the economic engine that was supposed to provide for their senior years. The middle class is hit the hardest because they fall into the financial no man's land. The very wealthy have enough liquid assets, stocks, art, or secondary properties, to trade equity without touching the primary residence or refinancing debt. The lower-income demographic often has fewer shared assets to begin with, making the legal split simpler, though no less painful. But the middle class, whose entire net worth is tied up in a single home and a retirement fund, finds that the 2026 legal and economic environment is designed to punish the dissolution of the nuclear unit. We also have to account for the divorce tax on everyday life. Historical trends in 2026 show that the cost of living for a single person is roughly 40 to 50% higher than for a person in a dual-income household. Everything from car insurance premiums to health insurance deductibles and bulk buy grocery savings vanishes the moment the household splits. In a 2026 economy where inflation has already thinned out discretionary spending, this 50% singles tax often pushes newly divorced individuals from the middle class into a state of perpetual financial precarity. This leads us to a fascinating demographic shift in how people are choosing their legal representation. In 2026, we have seen a 40% increase in pro-se filings, individuals representing themselves, and the use of automated, subscription-based legal platforms. The traditional model of hiring two opposing attorneys at $400 an hour is becoming a luxury of the elite. Case studies of these algorithm divorces suggest that while they are cheaper and faster, they often fail to account for the nuanced future tax implications of asset division, leading to financial aftershocks 3 to 5 years down the line. The data also reveals a specific vulnerability in the career trajectory of the divorced middle class. Historically, married individuals, particularly men, earn more than their single counterparts, a phenomenon known as the marriage premium. Upon divorce, this premium often evaporates. Why? The data suggests that the loss of a domestic partner who manages the invisible labor of the household leads to a decrease in workplace productivity and a withdrawal from high-stakes career opportunities. For a professional in 2026, the divorce isn't just a personal event. It is a direct hit to their human capital. As we analyze these historical trends, we begin to see a pattern. The 661 demographic isn't just a collection of individuals making choices. It is a massive economic reorganization of the United States. We are moving toward a society where the stability gap is the new class divide. Those who can stay together or afford to split are pulling away from those who are trapped in the middle. But there is one factor we haven't touched on yet, and it is perhaps the most explosive part of the 2026 data. It is the role of infidelity in the digital age. With the rise of sophisticated AI-generated deepfakes and the micro-cheating culture of social media, the definition of betrayal has changed, and it is showing up in the 2026 court filings in a way that would have been unrecognizable 10 years ago. How does a digital affair impact a no-fault divorce state? And what is the rebound trap that is currently causing a spike in second divorce rates, which are historically 20% higher than first divorce rates? In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to dive into the technology of betrayal. We will look at how 2026 surveillance tech is being used in custody battles and the shocking data on why second marriages are statistically more likely to fail within the first 5 years. We will also uncover the specific month of the year when divorce filings spike by 30%, and why it isn't January. The widely held belief that January is the peak month for divorce, often dubbed Divorce Month by the media, is actually a demographic myth when you scrutinize the historical trends of the last few decades leading into 2026. While January sees a massive spike in Google searches for divorce attorneys and legal advice, the actual filings do not surge until March. This discrepancy is what sociologists call the domestic holiday lag. In the United States, families often adhere to a social contract that mandates a ceasefire during the period between Thanksgiving and Valentine's Day. Couples like Alex and Taylor in 2026 might realize their marriage is functionally over in November, but they consciously choose to perform the role of a happy unit for the sake of children, extended family, and social expectations. Once the finality of Valentine's Day passes and the tax season begins, providing the necessary liquidity through tax refunds to pay for initial legal retainers, the March surge begins. Data from the University of Washington indicates that divorce filings consistently peak in March and August, mirroring the conclusion of winter and summer breaks. This suggests that the timing of a divorce is less about a sudden emotional snap and more about a calculated logistical window. While the timing is predictable, the catalysts in 2026 have become increasingly complex due to the rise of digital infidelity and the micro-cheating culture. Historically, infidelity required physical proximity and clandestine meetings. In 2026, the definition of betrayal has expanded to include a spectrum of digital behaviors that leave a permanent, discoverable trail. We are seeing a historical trend where digital affairs, emotional connections maintained through encrypted apps, social media interactions, or even virtual reality environments, are cited in nearly 40% of divorce petitions. This is the era of the micro-cheat, where a spouse might never physically touch another person, but the level of emotional investment and secrecy creates a breach of the marital contract that is just as devastating as physical adultery. Imagine Alex, who lives in a suburb of Atlanta in 2026. He doesn't have a traditional affair. Instead, he spends 3 hours every night engaging in deep, vulnerable conversations with an old flame on a localized social platform. He hides his screen when Taylor enters the room. He uses biometrics to lock specific folders. In the eyes of the 2026 legal system in a no-fault state like Georgia, this behavior doesn't technically impact the division of assets, but it is the primary driver of the emotional dissolution of the marriage. However, there is a financial caveat: the dissipation of marital assets. If Alex spent joint funds on digital gifts, subscriptions, or travel to meet this person, that money can be clawed back during the settlement. Case studies show that in 2026, forensic digital accounting is now a standard part of the discovery process, with experts scanning blockchain transactions and app store histories to find hidden expenditures related to these secondary relationships. This leads us to the terrifying reality of surveillance technology in 2026 custody battles. In the past, a private investigator might follow a spouse to a hotel. Today, the investigator is built into the home itself. Smart home systems, connected car logs, and even wearable fitness trackers are being subpoenaed as silent witnesses in divorce court. Imagine a scenario where Taylor claims Alex is habitually late for his parenting time, or is frequently intoxicated. In 2026, Taylor doesn't need a witness. She has the log from the smart lock on the front door showing exactly when Alex arrived, and data from his vehicle's cabin sensors that detect alcohol vapors. This level of granular surveillance has turned the modern divorce into a data war. Historical trends indicate that as our lives become more integrated with the Internet of Things, the privacy we once expected within a marriage has completely evaporated, making the legal process more adversarial, even in an era that promotes mediation. But what happens after the papers are signed? The demographics of the rebound are perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of the 661 study. In 2026, second marriages are failing at a rate of 60 to 67%, while third marriages hit a staggering 73% failure rate. This is the rebound trap. The data suggests that individuals who divorce often carry the same unresolved behavioral patterns into their next union, but with the added complexity of the incomplete institution. This is a sociological term for blended families. Unlike the traditional nuclear family, the blended family lacks clear social norms and legal frameworks. Who disciplines the stepchildren? How are holiday schedules managed between 4 different sets of grandparents? In 2026, the friction of managing a blended family is cited as the primary reason for the collapse of second marriages within the first 5 years. Case studies of second marriage failures often point to the premature commitment. After the trauma of a first divorce, many individuals seek the security of a new partner too quickly, often skipping the necessary period of individual stabilization. In 2026, the digital dating market accelerates this process. An individual can go from a signed decree to a new cohabitating partner in 6 months. However, the historical trend shows that marriages formed during this period of emotional transition are statistically fragile. They often lack the deep-rooted foundational values of a first marriage and are built instead on a reaction to what was missing in the previous relationship. Furthermore, we have to look at the financial weight of the second divorce. In 2026, if you are entering a second marriage with existing alimony or child support obligations, your new household starts in a state of financial deficit. This creates immediate stress. If the second marriage also fails, the individual faces a compounding economic disaster. They may be paying support to 2 different former spouses while trying to maintain a third household. This creates a demographic of the financially hollowed-out middle-aged adult, where a lifetime of earnings is redistributed through a series of legal settlements. As we move through 2026, we are also seeing the emergence of digital assets as a major point of contention in these splits. It's no longer just about the house and the 401k. It's about the family YouTube channel with 500,000 subscribers, the shared cryptocurrency wallet, and the ownership of non-fungible tokens or virtual real estate. Who gets the rights to the intellectual property created during the marriage? Historical trends show that courts are struggling to keep up with the valuation of these intangible assets. In a 2026 case study from California, a couple spent more on legal fees debating the ownership of a high-value social media handle than they did on their actual home equity. This is the new frontier of American divorce. It is a high-stakes, data-driven, and technologically complex transition that touches every aspect of our lives. We have moved from the fault era to the no-fault era, and we are now entering the evidence era, where every text, every location ping, and every digital purchase is a potential weapon in the dissolution of the family unit. But while the adults are fighting over data and assets, what is happening to the most vulnerable demographic in this equation? In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the devastating data behind the children of divorce in 2026. We will explore the longitudinal studies on the invisible scars of high-conflict litigation and why the concept of staying together for the kids is being reevaluated by modern psychologists. We will also dive into the specific data on how a parent's divorce impacts a child's future earning potential and their own likelihood of marital success. The cycle of the 661 demographic doesn't end with the parents. It is being encoded into the next generation. We will uncover the math of the generational divorce cycle next. The intergenerational transmission of divorce is one of the most studied and yet most misunderstood mathematical cycles in American sociology. In 2026, the data has become even more refined, allowing us to see exactly how the choices of one generation act as a blueprint for the next. This is not a matter of biological destiny, but of behavioral modeling and economic shifts. Historically, a child whose parents divorced is roughly 2 to 3 times more likely to see their own marriage end in dissolution compared to a child from an intact family. To understand why, we have to look at the life of Emily, a fictional but representative 10-year-old living in suburban Virginia in 2026. Emily is currently navigating a 2255 custody schedule. This means she spends 2 days with her mother, 2 days with her father, and then 5-day blocks alternating between them. While this arrangement is designed to provide maximum stability and equal access to both parents, it introduces a logistical and psychological tax that is unique to the children of the 661 demographic. For Emily, the concept of home is no longer a single anchored location. It is a fluid state. She has 2 sets of clothes, 2 sets of rules, and 2 different emotional climates to navigate. This leads to the first major data point in our masterclass: the erosion of the conflict resolution model. In an intact household, a child witnesses, ideally, the process of negotiation, compromise, and reconciliation. They see that friction does not necessarily lead to fracture. However, in a divorced household, the child often only sees the fracture. When Emily reaches adulthood in the late 2030s, her default psychological setting for marital stress may be the exit. Case studies from longitudinal research suggest that children of divorce often lack the interpersonal tools to navigate the mid-level friction of a long-term relationship because they never saw it successfully modeled. Instead of leaning into the discomfort of growth, they may view divorce as the natural and inevitable conclusion to relationship dissatisfaction. But there is a deeper, more controversial layer to this: the sleeper effect. Coined by researchers like Judith Wallerstein, the sleeper effect describes how children of divorce often appear resilient and well-adjusted throughout their teenage years, only to experience a psychological collapse when they reach the age of forming their own serious, adult romantic bonds. For a character like Emily, the trauma of her parents' 2026 split might not manifest until she is 25. When she enters a relationship that feels like it could lead to marriage, she may be hit with a paralyzing fear of abandonment or an intense skepticism of the institution of marriage itself. The data shows that these individuals often self-sabotage their relationships as a preemptive strike, ending things before they can be left, thereby fulfilling the statistical probability of the cycle. Now, let's look at the economic math of the generational cycle. Divorce is fundamentally a wealth-stripping event. In 2026, the cost of maintaining 2 households on the same income pool that once supported one leads to a significant reduction in the surplus capital available for a child's future. Historical trends indicate that children from divorced families are statistically less likely to complete a 4-year college degree. This is not due to a lack of intelligence but a lack of resources. When the family unit splits, the college fund is often the first casualty of legal fees and increased living expenses. For Emily, this could mean a transition from a planned private university to a local community college, or the necessity of taking on significant student debt. This economic disadvantage then follows her into her own marriage, where financial stress remains the #1 cited cause for divorce in the United States. The cycle is not just psychological. It is a financial loop where the instability of the parents creates an environment of scarcity for the child, which in turn makes the child's future marriage more vulnerable to economic pressure. We also have to address the staying together for the kids debate, which has undergone a radical transformation in 2026. For decades, the prevailing wisdom was that any divorce was damaging to children. However, modern data suggests a more nuanced reality. Research now distinguishes between low-conflict and high-conflict marriages. In a high-conflict marriage, where the child is a witness to constant verbal or physical hostility, the data actually favors divorce. Children in these environments experience chronically elevated levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, which can lead to long-term health issues and impaired brain development. For these children, a low-conflict divorce is a net positive. It removes them from a war zone and allows their nervous systems to regulate. However, the 2026 data shows that the majority of American divorces, roughly 60 to 70%, occur in low-conflict marriages. These are the marriages where the parents simply grew apart or felt unfulfilled, rather than abusive. For a child in this scenario, the divorce is often a total shock. Because they did not see the war leading up to the split, the dissolution of their home feels arbitrary and terrifying. These children are the ones most likely to experience the sleeper effect and the highest rates of future marital instability. They lose their sense of security without the justification of seeing a toxic environment. Another factor we must analyze in 2026 is the role of digital co-parenting. In the past, a divorced child might have been a messenger between 2 parents who didn't speak. Today, parents use apps like Our Family Wizard or Talking Parents. While these tools reduce the direct conflict Emily witnesses, they also create a digital paper trail that can be weaponized in ongoing litigation. The child in 2026 is often aware that their parents are building a case against each other through every logged message and shared calendar event. This creates a state of hypervigilance. Emily may begin to monitor her own behavior, wondering if a comment she makes to her father will end up as a screenshot in her mother's next legal filing. This atmosphere of surveillance is the invisible scar of the 2026 divorce demographic. Furthermore, we are seeing the rise of child-inclusive mediation. This is a historical shift where children, even as young as Emily, are given a neutral therapist to help them articulate their needs to the court. While intended to empower the child, it can also lead to a phenomenon known as parentification. This is when the child feels responsible for the emotional well-being of their parents. Emily might feel she has to take care of her father during his weekend because he seems lonely, or she might hide her happiness about a new toy from her mother to avoid making her feel financially inadequate. This emotional labor is a heavy burden that statistically correlates with higher rates of depression and anxiety in adulthood. The math of the 661 demographic is clear. The divorce of the parents changes the baseline probability for the child. But as we look at the United States in 2026, we see a generation of young adults who are becoming aware of these cycles. They are the ones driving the slow love movement we discussed earlier, using the data of their parents' failures to engineer more resilient unions. They are seeking premarital counseling at record rates and drafting social media prenups to protect their emotional and digital boundaries. But as these children of divorce grow up and enter the workforce, they encounter a new set of demographic pressures. What happens to the marriage premium in a world where everyone expects things to fail? And how does the feminization of poverty in the wake of divorce specifically impact the career trajectories of these adult children? In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to dive into the raw economic aftermath of the split. We will look at the gendered wealth gap that opens up the moment the decree is signed, and the shocking truth about why men's standard of living often rises after divorce while women's plummets. We will explore the specific 2026 tax implications of alimony and why the silver divorcee is the fastest growing demographic in American poverty statistics. The financial fallout is deeper than you think. The financial divergence that occurs the moment a divorce decree is signed in 2026 is one of the most stark socioeconomic shifts in the American landscape. While the emotional weight is shared, the economic aftermath is notoriously asymmetrical. To understand the raw mechanics of this, let us look at the case study of Marcus and Elena, a couple living in a high cost of living area like Seattle. They have been married for 15 years. Marcus earns $140,000 a year as a senior project manager. Elena, who took 7 years out of the workforce to raise their 2 children and currently works part-time in education, earns $45,000. In the eyes of the 2026 legal system, their assets are divided 50-50, but their future earning potential, their human capital, is not. Historical trends show that after a divorce, a man's standard of living often remains stable or even increases after an initial adjustment period, while a woman's standard of living drops by an average of 41%. This is the 41% cliff. For Marcus, the math is straightforward. Even after paying child support, he retains a high-income trajectory. He moves into a smaller, modern apartment, and his primary expenses are individualized. For Elena, the math is a struggle for survival. She now bears the primary costs of a household capable of housing 2 children, yet she does so with a fraction of the former household income. In 2026, the cost of childcare, health insurance premiums for a single-parent plan, and the loss of economies of scale in grocery and utility spending create a compounding deficit. This is often referred to as the pink tax of divorce. A critical driver of this disparity in 2026 is the legacy of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which fundamentally altered the tax treatment of alimony. Prior to 2019, alimony was tax-deductible for the payer and taxable for the recipient. In the 2026 tax environment, this is no longer the case. Alimony is now paid in after-tax dollars. For Marcus, every dollar he sends to Elena is a dollar he has already been taxed on at his high marginal rate. For Elena, that money is tax-free, but because Marcus is losing the deduction, there is less total money on the table during negotiations. This has led to a historical trend where alimony awards are smaller and shorter in duration than they were in the late 20th century. The middle class, in particular, finds that the government is essentially taking a larger bite out of the fractured family's total wealth than it did when they were a single tax filing unit. Now let us zoom into the fastest growing and most financially vulnerable demographic, the silver divorcee. These are women over the age of 65 who are divorcing after long-term marriages. Imagine Diane, a 67-year-old in Florida, who is ending a 40-year marriage in 2026. Diane's situation represents a looming crisis in the American social safety net. Throughout her marriage, Diane was the primary caregiver, which meant she had lower lifetime earnings and consequently, lower Social Security contributions. While she is entitled to a portion of her husband's Social Security benefit under the 10-year rule, which states that if a marriage lasted 10 years or longer, a divorced spouse can receive benefits based on the ex-spouse's record. This benefit is often not enough to cover the rising cost of private senior housing and healthcare in 2026. Historical trends indicate that divorced women over 65 are 80% more likely to live in poverty than those who remain married, and they are significantly more likely to be impoverished than widowed women. Why? Because a widow often inherits the entirety of a couple's combined assets and life insurance. A divorcee, however, sees those assets split down the middle at a time when there is no longer a career runway to recoup the losses. In 2026, we are seeing the depletion of the 401k as a primary driver of senior poverty. When a $600,000 retirement fund is split into two $300,000 accounts, both parties lose the safety margin required to combat 2026 level inflation. Diane's $300,000, which seemed like a fortune in 2005, now barely covers 10 years of assisted living. Furthermore, we must address the asset trap of the family home in the 2026 economy. For decades, the standard advice was for the wife to keep the house in exchange for the husband keeping the retirement accounts. In 2026, this is often a catastrophic financial mistake. A house is an illiquid, high-maintenance asset. For a silver divorcee like Diane, keeping a $500,000 home that is fully paid off might seem like security. However, when you factor in the 2026 property taxes, soaring homeowners insurance premiums in climate-vulnerable states, and the cost of maintaining an aging structure, the house becomes an equity-eating monster. Without a high monthly income, the house forces the divorcee into a cash-poor existence. Case studies show that many women in this demographic are forced to sell their homes within 3 years of the divorce, often during a market downturn or under the pressure of a looming repair, realizing too late that they traded a liquid, growing retirement fund for a static, depreciating roof. This brings us to the career on-ramping crisis. For younger divorcees like Elena, the 2026 job market is highly specialized. A woman who has been out of the professional loop for 7 to 10 years faces a massive skills gap. While she may have been a high performer in 2016, the integration of generative AI and automated workflows in 2026 means her previous experience is functionally obsolete. The cost of retraining and the time required to reach her former earning potential creates a permanent wealth gap. This is the motherhood penalty compounded by the divorce penalty. Statistical models show that for every year a woman stays out of the workforce, her lifetime earnings drop significantly, and divorce acts as the event that crystallizes that loss into a daily reality. We also have to look at the hidden cost of the singles tax. In 2026, the United States economy is increasingly optimized for dual-income households. From family plan cellular discounts to bulk buying at wholesale clubs and the per square foot cost of housing, everything is cheaper when shared. When a household splits, the cost of living for each individual does not drop by 50%. It typically drops by only 20%, while the income has been cut in half. This 30% gap is the friction that grinds down the middle class. For Marcus and Elena, having 2 internet bills, 2 heating bills, and 2 sets of lawn equipment in 2026 represents a total loss of household efficiency that would have otherwise gone toward savings or investments. As we analyze these historical trends, it becomes clear that divorce in 2026 is an economic restructuring that favors the person with the highest individual earning power and the most liquid assets. It punishes those who invested their time into the domestic sphere, a role that has no market value in a divorce court. We are seeing a demographic shift where marriage is increasingly viewed as a financial risk management exercise, leading to the rise of the postnuptial agreement, where couples in their 40s are proactively defining their asset splits to avoid the catastrophic 41% cliff. But there is another layer to this demographic puzzle. While the financial fallout is measurable in dollars and cents, there is a burgeoning industry that thrives on this instability. We are talking about the multi-billion-dollar divorce machine. From high-conflict attorneys to forensic accountants and specialized real estate agents, the cost of ending a marriage has become its own sector of the U.S. economy. In 2026, The average cost of a contested divorce has reached levels that can consume up to 30% of a middle-class couple's total net worth. Who are the players in this industry, and how do they influence the likelihood of a settlement versus a trial? And what is the shocking data regarding the legal billable hour and its correlation to the length of a custody battle? In the next part of this masterclass, we will dive into the predatory side of the 661 demographic, the divorce industrial complex. We will look at how the 2026 legal system is designed to incentivize conflict and the specific tactics used to drain marital estates before the first support check is ever written. The business of breaking up is more profitable than you can imagine. The divorce industrial complex in 2026 is a well-oiled machine that generates billions of dollars in revenue by capitalizing on the breakdown of the American family. To understand the 661 demographic shift, we must look at where the money goes when a marriage dissolves. It is a historical trend that the longer a divorce takes, the more profitable it becomes for the ecosystem of professionals surrounding the case. Imagine a character named Brian, a middle manager at a logistics firm in New Jersey in 2026. Brian and his wife Sarah have a net worth of approximately $400,000, most of it tied up in home equity and a shared 401k. When they decided to split, they didn't realize they were entering a theater of war where the primary beneficiaries were not themselves or their children, but their legal representatives. In the United States, the adversarial nature of the family court system creates a zero-sum game. For Brian to win a point on custody or asset division, Sarah must lose. This structure is the fuel for the billable hour. In 2026, the average hourly rate for a seasoned family law attorney in a major metropolitan area ranges from $450 to $700. When you factor in paralegal fees, filing costs, and administrative overhead, a single phone call or a drafted motion can cost several $100s. Historical trends show that the divorce industrial complex relies on the tactical use of conflict. An attorney might send an aggressive, high-conflict letter to the opposing counsel over a minor disagreement, such as who keeps a specific piece of furniture or the exact timing of a holiday pickup. This letter triggers a high-conflict response, which leads to a four-way meeting, which leads to more billable hours. Case studies of contested divorces in 2026 reveal a phenomenon known as the equity bleed. Let us look at the math of Brian's situation. Brian and Sarah are arguing over a $15,000 credit card debt and the ownership of a vintage car valued at $20,000. To resolve this, they engage in discovery, which involves subpoenas, depositions, and the formal exchange of thousands of pages of financial documents. By the time they reach a settlement on these two items, they have each spent $25,000 in legal fees. Mathematically, they have spent $50,000 to decide the fate of $35,000 in value. This is the irrationality of the litigated divorce. In the 2026 economy, this loss of capital is devastating because it is often funded by high-interest credit cards or loans taken against the very retirement accounts they are fighting over. Beyond the attorneys, the 661 demographic is also served by a secondary layer of specialists, the forensic accountants and the custody evaluators. In 2026, if one spouse suspects the other of hiding assets, perhaps in a cryptocurrency wallet or an offshore digital account, they must hire a forensic accountant. These professionals often charge a retainer of $5,000 to $10,000 just to begin the audit. While they are highly effective at tracing digital footprints, the cost of the search often exceeds the value of the assets recovered. Similarly, in high-conflict custody disputes, a guardian ad litem or a court-appointed psychologist may be brought in to evaluate the best interests of the child. These evaluations can cost between $10,000 and $30,000. For a middle-class family, these professional fees act as a massive redistribution of wealth from the family unit to the professional class. The divorce industrial complex also utilizes the psychological state of the litigants. In 2026, the emotional trauma of a split makes individuals susceptible to the sunk cost fallacy. Once Brian has spent $40,000 on his legal team, he feels he cannot quit or settle for less than a total victory, because doing so would mean the $40,000 was wasted. He is encouraged by the system to keep fighting for a potential outcome that rarely exists. A sense of vindication from the court. Historical trends indicate that family court judges in 2026 are increasingly overwhelmed and disinterested in the emotional grievances of the parties. They view the divorce as a business dissolution. Yet, the legal marketing machine often frames the process as a quest for justice, leading to further delays and higher costs. We also see the emergence of specialized real estate services in 2026. These are agents who focus exclusively on the forced sale of marital homes. Because these sales are often court-ordered and must happen within a strict time frame, the sellers have less bargaining power. This creates a secondary market where investors can pick up properties at a slight discount, while the divorcing couple pays a higher commission to the specialized agent for managing the high-tension communication between the ex-spouses. This is another layer of the wealth stripping process. The family home, which was supposed to be the bedrock of Brian's 2026 financial stability, becomes a liquid asset that is carved up to pay for the very process of its destruction. Is there an alternative? In 2026, the data shows a sharp divide between the litigated model and the mediated model. Couples who choose mediation or collaborative divorce spend an average of $5,000 to $10,000 total. This represents a 90% reduction in cost compared to a fully contested trial. However, the divorce industrial complex has a vested interest in steering high-net-worth or high-conflict couples away from these efficient models. By emphasizing the risks of being taken advantage of, the system keeps couples in the adversarial loop. This is why the 661 demographic study is so vital. It highlights that the greatest threat to a divorcing couple's financial future is often the process itself, not the ex-spouse. Historical trends also show that the duration of a divorce has a direct correlation with the mental health outcomes of the children involved. In 2026, a divorce that drags on for 2 or 3 years creates a state of chronic instability for children like Emily, whom we discussed earlier. The constant uncertainty of where they will live and the ongoing tension between parents are exacerbated by the legal maneuvering. Every motion filed and every deposition taken is a brick in the wall between the parents' ability to co-parent effectively in the future. The professional system, while claiming to act in the best interests of the child, often prioritizes the procedural requirements of the case over the emotional timeline of the family. In 2026, we are also seeing the rise of litigation funding in divorce. This is a practice where third-party companies provide the capital for a spouse to hire a top-tier legal team in exchange for a percentage of the final settlement. While this can provide a level playing field for a spouse who has been financially controlled, it introduces a profit motive for an outside entity to ensure the settlement is as high as possible, often discouraging early and reasonable compromises. This effectively turns the dissolution of a marriage into a speculative investment for Wall Street-backed funds. This leads us to a crucial question about the future of the American social structure. If the cost of divorce is so high that it consumes the majority of a family's savings, what happens to the social mobility of the next generation? When Brian's $400,000 estate is reduced to $200,000 after legal fees and asset splits, and then further eroded by the cost of maintaining 2 households, the surplus capital intended for his children's education or his own retirement vanishes. The divorce industrial complex isn't just an expense. It is a permanent downgrade in the economic trajectory of the American middle class. As we look at these historical trends, we must ask, how do people recover from this? Is there a path back to stability after the divorce industrial complex has finished its work? And what is the shocking reality of the 2026 dating market for those who have been through the machine? It turns out that the demographic of the once divorced is creating a new, highly cautious social class that is redefining the very concept of the American dream. In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to explore the Great Rebuilding. We will look at the demographics of remarriage and the rise of the LAT relationship, living apart together. We will uncover why 40% of divorced adults in 2026 are choosing to never marry again, and how this is triggering a massive shift in the U.S. housing and healthcare industries. The aftermath of the split is where the new American identity is truly being forged. Stay tuned as we look at life after the 661 collapse. The Great Rebuilding is not a linear path. It is a fragmented restructuring of the American soul. In 2026, the demographics of life after divorce reveal a nation that is increasingly wary of the traditional marital contract. When the dust settles on the legal battles we have discussed, the individual is left in a state of hyperautonomy. Let us look at the case study of Mark, a 46-year-old software architect in Denver. After his 661 collapse, Mark finds himself in a demographic that is statistically the most likely to seek a second union within 5 years: middle-aged men. Historical trends suggest that men often experience a sharper decline in subjective well-being immediately following a split, primarily due to the loss of a primary social and domestic coordinator. In 2026, Mark represents the millions of men who re-enter the dating market not just for romance, but for the restorative structure that a partner provides. However, the market he enters in 2026 is unrecognizable compared to the one he left 20 years ago. The dating industrial complex has pivoted to target the divorce demographic with surgical precision. Data shows that 40% of new users on high-intent dating platforms are individuals coming out of long-term marriages. These users are high-value targets. They have higher discretionary income and a sense of urgency. But there is a demographic paradox at play. While men like Mark are rushing back toward the altar, women in the same age bracket are increasingly opting out. Historical trends in 2026 show that women who divorce in their 40s and 50s are the group most likely to report an increase in life satisfaction and a decrease in the desire to ever cohabitate again. This gender divergence in post-divorce goals is creating a massive mismatch in the social ecosystem. Imagine if the primary romantic goal of the future was not to share a life, but to share a schedule. This is the birth of the LAT relationship, living apart together. In 2026, LAT has moved from a fringe lifestyle choice to a mainstream demographic category. It involves couples who are in a committed, long-term, often monogamous relationship but maintain separate residences. This is the ultimate hedge against the financial and emotional risks of the 661 demographic. For a woman like Sarah in 2026, who just spent 3 years fighting for her share of the home equity, the idea of merging finances again feels like a strategic error. LAT allows for the emotional benefits of partnership without the legal vulnerability of a shared roof. The historical trend shows a 25% increase in LAT arrangements among the over 45 demographic since 2018. This is not just about personal space, it is about asset protection. In a LAT relationship, there is no commingling of property, no shared debt, and no requirement for a complex asset division if the relationship ends. This shift towards solo living or LAT arrangements is sending shockwaves through the United States housing industry. For a century, the American housing market was built on the assumption of the nuclear family. The 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom suburban home was the gold standard. But in 2026, the demographic reality is a mismatch. We have a glut of family homes and a critical shortage of high-quality single-occupancy units. In cities like Austin and Seattle, urban planners are being forced to rethink zoning laws to accommodate the rise of the single. We are seeing the explosion of the luxury micro-unit, apartments under 500 square feet that are designed for high-income, divorced professionals who prioritize location and amenities over square footage. Furthermore, the 2026 data reveals the rise of co-housing communities specifically designed for single parents. Imagine a complex where 4 single mothers each have their own private apartment, but share a central communal kitchen, a laundry facility, and a supervised play area. This is a demographic response to the 41% cliff we discussed earlier. By pooling resources in childcare, these families are creating a synthetic nuclear family that provides the economic stability of a dual-income household without the marital contract. This is a historical shift in the American concept of community. We are moving from kinship-based housing to affinity-based housing. The healthcare industry is also feeling the impact of the 661 aftermath. In 2026, loneliness is being treated not just as a social issue, but as a clinical demographic risk factor. The data is sobering. Divorced individuals, particularly men who live alone, show a 30% higher risk of cardiovascular events and a significantly higher rate of chronic inflammation compared to their married peers. The health premium of marriage turns out to be a very real statistical factor. Partners act as biological regulators. They notice the strange mole, they encourage the doctor's visit, and they provide the neurochemical buffer of physical touch. In 2026, the healthcare system is seeing a surge in social prescribing, where doctors prescribe community engagement or group therapy to divorce patients to mitigate the physical toll of isolation. We must also consider the once divorced as a new political and consumer class. In 2026, this group represents nearly 20% of the adult population in the U.S. They have specific consumption patterns. They travel more, they spend more on self-improvement and wellness, and they are more likely to support policies that protect individual asset rights over collective family subsidies. They are the demographic driving the self-care economy, which in 2026 has expanded to include everything from divorce retreat centers to AI-driven grief coaches. But as this group navigates the great rebuilding, they are faced with a new question. What does it mean to be a family in the absence of a marriage? We are seeing the emergence of the chosen family model. where the legal definitions of the past are being replaced by emotional and functional bonds. In 2026, nearly 15% of divorced adults are naming a non-relative or even a former spouse as their primary healthcare proxy or executor of their estate. This is a radical departure from historical trends and signals a deepening of the individualistic shift we have been tracking. The American identity is being forged in the fire of these transitions. We are no longer a nation defined solely by the 50-year anniversary. We are a nation defined by the pivot, the restart, and the resilient solo trajectory. But there is one final piece of the puzzle. If the traditional marriage model is fracturing, what does the endgame look like? As the 661 demographic ages, we are heading toward a massive collision between our individualistic lifestyle and our collective need for end-of-life care. In the final part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the legacy demographics. We will explore the inheritance crisis of 2026, where fractured families are fighting over the largest transfer of wealth in U.S. history. We will look at the death of the traditional estate and the rise of the final alimony. Most importantly, we will summarize everything we have learned into a single cohesive vision of the future of the American Union. Are we witnessing the death of marriage, or its ultimate evolution? The final numbers of this demographic study will reveal the true destination of the American family. As we analyze the culmination of the 661 demographic shift in 2026, we are forced to confront the most significant, and perhaps the most litigious event in the history of the American family: the fractured wealth transfer. For decades, economists have predicted the Great Wealth Transfer, a period where approximately $84 trillion will pass from the baby boomers and the silent generation to their heirs. In the simplified historical model of 1950, this transfer was a straight line, a vertical move from parents to children within a stable, lifelong union. However, in 2026, the demographics of divorce have turned this straight line into a chaotic web of competing claims. We are seeing a historical trend where the dissolution of marriages in the 1970s and 80s, followed by the gray divorce explosion of the 2010s, has created a legacy of fractured estates that the U.S. legal system is currently struggling to process. Imagine a character named Harold, a 78-year-old living in a well-appointed retirement community in Florida in 2026. Harold has a net worth of $2.5 million. Throughout his life, he has been part of the 661 cycle multiple times. He has 2 children from his first marriage in the 1970s, a stepdaughter from a second marriage that lasted 12 years, and a current spouse who is 20 years his junior with her own set of adult children. In a traditional historical context, Harold's estate would be a foundation for his biological children. In 2026, it is a battlefield. Case studies from probate courts show that when a patriarch or matriarch passes away in a fractured family, the likelihood of an estate being contested increases by over 400% compared to intact families. The demographic shift has created a new class of legal dispute: the step inheritance conflict. Biological children, who may have been estranged during the years of their parents' second or third marriage, are now returning to claim what they perceive as their birthright, often clashing with step-siblings and surviving spouses who provided the actual end-of-life care. This caregiving crisis is the second major demographic reality of 2026. In previous generations, the marriage contract provided a built-in healthcare system. Spouses were the primary, unpaid caregivers for each other as they aged. But with the rise of the silver divorcee, we are seeing a massive population of seniors who are entering their most vulnerable years without a live-in partner. This is the individualized aging demographic. For a person who divorced at 55 and never remarried, the burden of care in 2026 falls either on the state or on adult children who are themselves navigating the high-cost, dual-income trap economy we discussed earlier. The data shows that the children of divorced parents often experience a 20% higher rate of caregiver burnout because they are often managing the care of 2 separate households, sometimes for parents who still refuse to be in the same room together. The economic cost of this inefficiency is staggering, as it pulls productive workers out of the labor force and depletes the very inheritance they were hoping to receive. So, are we witnessing the death of marriage? The final numbers of our 661 study suggest a much more complex potential outcome. In 2026, marriage is not dying. It is undergoing a great sorting. We are moving toward a society where the traditional lifelong marriage is becoming an elite luxury good. The data shows a stark divergence. For the top 20% of earners with advanced degrees, marriage rates are stabilizing, and divorce rates are actually lower than they were in the 1990s. For this demographic, marriage is a capstone. a highly stable resource-pooling institution that compounds wealth and provides a competitive advantage for their children. Conversely, for the remaining 80%, marriage is becoming more fragile and less frequent. This is the marriage gap, and it is the primary driver of wealth inequality in 2026. If you can stay married, you are statistically likely to stay in the middle or upper class. If you enter the 661 cycle of divorce and remarriage, your path to long-term financial security is significantly more precarious. As we look toward 2030, the historical trends suggest the emergence of the beta marriage or the fixed-term marriage. In 2026, we are seeing the first legislative discussions around the concept of marital contracts that have a built-in renewal clause, say every 7 or 10 years. This is a demographic response to the reality that humans are living longer and evolving through multiple distinct life stages. Instead of a default till death do us part contract that requires a traumatic and expensive legal intervention to break, the future may favor a contract that requires an active choice to continue. This would fundamentally change the demographics of divorce by turning a failure into an expiration, potentially reducing the adversarial nature of the split and the associated wealth-stripping legal fees. Furthermore, we must address the digital legacy. In 2026, our identities are increasingly stored in the cloud. A significant portion of a modern couple's value is tied up in digital accounts, social media influence, and encrypted assets. The 661 demographic of the future will not just be fighting over the house in the suburbs. They will be fighting over the rights to the AI-generated content created during the union and the access codes to the family's digital memories. Historical trends indicate that digital asset division will become the most complex part of family law by the end of this decade, requiring a new class of digital arbitrators to manage the split. In conclusion, the demographics of divorce in U.S. history show us that we are a resilient, albeit fractured society. We have moved from a culture of obligation to a culture of fulfillment. While this has led to a spike in instability and the emergence of the divorce industrial complex, it has also allowed for a level of individual autonomy and personal safety that was previously unimaginable. The 661 demographic is the story of the American search for the perfect union, a search that often requires multiple attempts and significant economic sacrifice. As we close this deep dive masterclass, remember that the data is not your destiny. Understanding these historical trends, from the 41% cliff to the social contagion of the divorce cascade, provides you with the clarity to navigate your own life choices with eyes wide open. The American family is not disappearing. It is simply becoming more modular, more intentional, and more complex. We are no longer defined by the single house with the white picket fence, but by the strength of the networks we build after the fence comes down. The question that remains for the next decade is how the U.S. government and the private sector will adapt to this new reality of the solo individual and the fractured family. With the birth rate at historic lows and the aging population at historic highs, the economic pressure to solve the stability gap has never been greater. Will we see a return to incentivize marriage through tax reform, or will we see the total individualization of the American tax code? In our next series, we will pivot from the end of relationships to the future of work. We will dive into the data of the freelance nation, exploring how the collapse of the traditional 9-to-5 is mirroring the collapse of the traditional family, and what the 2027 labor market holds for those who are brave enough to go it alone. We will investigate the rise of the digital nomad, the death of the corporate pension, and the secret math of the side hustle economy that is currently keeping the American dream on life support. The transition from the marital unit to the economic unit of one is just beginning. Stay tuned as we uncover the next chapter of the American evolution.